All right, so here's this part that I was hinting at where we would discuss the specific sociopolitical typologies. Now, we call it sociopolitical because we're not just talking about political power, we're also talking about the rules that regulate identity, like who belongs to particular populations and don't, and the rules that regulate social movement, like eligible marriage partners, etc. So it's mediating more than just governing, it's mediating rules surrounding social relationships. That's why it's socio-political typology. By considering who controls food and other critical resources in any given society, Marshall Solins and Elman Service define these four types of society. And they are forager bands, or bands. These are the smallest scale society, generally no more than about 50 individuals. That these groups would be part of a metapopulation. So, for example, among the Aceh. At the point of contact, there were 800 northern Aceh, but they would organize themselves into smaller bands. And so each band may only have between about 20 and 35 people. The interesting thing about foraging bands is that they're fluid. You can join any band with which you have marriage and or kinship ties. And of course, if you only have a greater metapopulation of about 800, you've got kinship ties with anyone. So you get sick of somebody, you get mad at them, you just change your band membership. You go and join another group. And as long as you're fulfilling your role and sharing and such, then you're fine in any of the groups that you might find yourselves. They're non-centralized. They're egalitarian. Women have considerable power. I mean, not more power than men, but what we find is relative gender equality. Um, so rule is by consensus. We focus uh, on achieved authority or power, the achieved status, that is, that which is based on your own characteristics. There's a lot of social mobility, and group norms are mediated through kind of their kinship and social obligations. So, one example from Nye's story of a Kung woman last week. Think of how Nye was treated by her uncle when she wasn't actually sleeping with Gunda, but was instead sleeping with other men, right? Her uncle chided her, he teased her, he tickled her, he made jokes about, get me a stick, I'm going to beat you like your husband should beat you. But none of that was really enforceable, right? It was done in a very kind of mocking manner. It was done congenially. Nye wasn't upset by it, but that expectation was still reinforced. Now, contrast that to how Nye's daughter was treated with the allegations of prostitution, having sex with white people for money, right? She was physically attacked. And it's a very aggressive and violent method of reinforcing those social norms. So it's often even conflict among hunter gatherers is done through something that generates laughter and familiar, kind of friendly relationships, whereas um, among more formalized central institutions with legal codes, it's done in a much more aggressive and violent manner. Second type of sociopolitical typology that has a little more structure, but not much, is tribal organization. Tribal government is also non centralized. We find it most often among horticultural and pastoral societies. And so in tribal leadership, there is a recognized leader at the local level. What that means is that, among pastoralists, it would be whoever is kind of leading the herds. Among horticulturalists, it would be at the village level because horticulturalists are sedentary. So there would be someone who has a position of power in that particular village. But a key difference between tribal organization and the next level up of chiefdom is that every village is equal ranking. So you kind of agree based on consensus who your village leadership should be, but and that individual will represent you in matters that go beyond the village and are entirely, like the whole tribe, etc. But that leader doesn't have any power or authority in other villages. Each village has their own group consensus based leader. The other thing that comes along with tribal leadership is the lack of actual political authority. What that means is that tribal leaders can make recommendations. And give suggestions, but they don't have any enforcement power. So they have to do what's called leading by example. So, one group that practices tribal leadership are the Yanomamo in Brazil. We'll talk about them a little bit more as we talk about conflict and such. But the Yanomamo have an individual called a village head. He's their de facto kind of leader of that particular village. He's not necessarily the most powerful man. He's not the oldest man, right? It's again achieved characteristics that give him those rights of leadership. The Yanomamo built their structures around a central plaza area. And so, one of the things that a village head might want to do is have people sweep and clean up the plaza. The only way he's going to get people to comply is if he leads by example, which means he has to be out there with a broom, sweeping and cleaning up the plaza. If he wants people to be generous and share resources with outsiders or share resources with other villages, he's going to have to cultivate a larger garden plot than anybody else. He's going to have to lead by demonstrating his generosity. So, whatever characteristics it is that the village head wants to promote, he's got to subscribe to those same kinds of practices. He has to lead by example. Chiefdoms are centralized governments, permanent kind of political positions that we find among agriculturalists. Now, this says that it's generally restricted now to the archaeological record. That's because really the world over, one of the last chiefdoms to transition to state level society were the Polynesian Islands, when the Polynesians of Hawaii and such were brought under territory of the U.S. government. So, chiefdoms are kind of like tribe plus, in the sense that kinship still wins out. But the difference between a tribe and a chiefdom is that the chiefdom, you see unequal social and power relationships between villages. So in tribes, you've got unequal power among individuals within a village, but villages are equal, whereas among chiefdoms, you've got not only unequal power within a village, but also unequal power within or between villages. And so chiefdoms are hierarchical, but they're based on kinship. So the individual in a chiefdom who has the highest power is the chief, and everyone is then ranked on how closely related they are to that chief. It's an enduring political structure because there are rules about how vacancies are filled. So when a chief dies, it may be his son that takes over. It may be his next youngest brother, etc. Right? There are formal rules about how succession is guaranteed. And one of the archaeological record like markers of transition from tribal organization to chiefdoms, that is transitioning to what we call a ranked society, are it's lavish burials of children. So among tribal leadership, because it's all based on achieved characteristics, you aren't going to have a tribal leader who is like 3 years old. In chiefdoms, you do, because that rank is inherited. And so when we start to see children buried with lavish amounts of material goods, gold, pottery, jewelry, etc., then we know that we've transitioned from tribal organization to chiefdom organization. What chiefs did was kind of regulate with a central authority the distribution of resources. The reason that we only find it among agriculturalists is because you had, with increasing population density, the only way you could feed people was through agriculture, but you also had to have some kind of system of distribution, consumption, and redistribution in place. And so what chiefdoms did was help to mediate the distribution of resources kind of equally among the villages. And they helped to redistribute localized kind of resources. So another area where we had kind of continuance of kind of a cross between tribal and chiefdom organization until relatively recent times was in the Pacific Northwest. When we think about, they were not really agriculturalists, they were foragers and horticulturalists in the Pacific Northwest, but they had large population density because the Pacific Northwest region is incredibly biodiverse. It's a temperate rainforest, for one, so you've got a lot of land resources, but it also has unusually rich marine resources too. And so you had these populations that were able to do things like whaling and going after seals and sea lions and going after these really large, package sized hunted marine resources. And so you would end up with chiefs across several villages that organized a cultural tradition called potlatching, which was where you would come together in celebration and have a feast. But during that feast, you would trade goods. You would everybody get to leave with like blankets and salted salmon and or smoked salmon or things like that. So it served as a way of redistributing goods from areas that had plentiful production, because you see like microclimate kinds of effects. You see movement of animals so that they're not evenly dispersed across the entire kind of range of villages. And so these potlatches allowed for redistribution of material goods between villages. And potlatches consist, I mean, technically they still persist. They are still a traditional kind of celebration and recognition of the harvest and recognition of these social relationships. But they were discouraged once European settlers, Americans, made it all the way over to the West Coast, which was in the mid to late 1800s. So we're talking about the California Gold Rush then driving contact with people in the Pacific Northwest regions. And it was Christian missionaries who came in and settled these groups into reservations. And they really tried to do away with potlatches because they viewed them as wasteful, right? They viewed them as also hearkening of more collectivist versus individual kind of identity and orientation. And then lastly, we have states. We are all intimately familiar with states. States are highly centralized. We find them among agriculturalists or industrialists, and arguably even among post industrialists, if we allow that to be a sixth adaptive strategy. And I mean, we see them among all modern nations. Now, there's not only one way to build a state, right? We recognize that states can be totalitarian. Look at North Korea. We recognize that states can be less democratic than we are. I mean, China defines itself as communist, so it's not really truly Marxist. We recognize that states can be democratic. We recognize that states can be autocracies or oligarchies, where we're looking at maintaining the status quo and economic interest really driving political interests. So there's not one way that a state must be, but what states do is they kind of isolate and condense and concentrate political power and structure into a set of offices. The one really big difference, and what we look for archaeologically and even in modern times to distinguish states from chiefdoms, is social stratification. So, one of the things that early states did that broke up some of the resistance was they dissolved these kinship categories, and instead they put people in social strata based on arbitrary reasons. And so when we think about stratification in modern America, right, we are socially stratified on the basis of race. But we are also very, very strongly socially stratified on economics and specifically stored wealth and household income. And one of the ways in which racial stratification has been reinforced is through economic stratification. If we look at poverty, for example, the bulk of the households that live at or below the poverty line in the US are households of color. The other really clear trend that we see with socioeconomic stratification in America is that um, single parent households, and specifically single parent female headed households, are much more likely to fall at or below the poverty line. So, what does this mean? This means divorced or never married women who have children. Are much, much more likely to fall at or below the poverty line. And so, really, from the time that children are born to these households, they are at a disadvantage. They live in areas that are economically depressed. Because those areas are economically depressed, sometimes people have to explore alternative methods of generating resources. And these may include methods that we classify as delinquent or even criminal. Right? They live in areas that are plagued with violence. So, violence is what they grow up knowing. That leaves a long lasting trauma marker in their brain, whether that violence comes just at the hands of their family or whether that violence comes just at the hands of the neighborhood. You know, they're at a disadvantage. Their brain is in kind of stress or panic mode from the time that they're born, really. So, we've got a lot of ways that stratification is reinforced in the US, and it's not only mediated through economics, but there's a really, really strong correlation between economics and race, economics and marital status, economics and region of the country in which you grew up, right? There are areas of the South that are really deep poverty. In New Mexico, Native Americans are much, much, much more likely to live at or below the poverty line. If you spend time on the reservations, right, you see extreme poverty. So um, this stratification based on these relatively more arbitrary kind of markers are this hallmark of states. Now, what do states do? Well, states have all sorts of power and authority. They've got legislative powers, they've got financial powers, judiciary powers. They define who's citizen and who's not citizen. They patrol their boundaries. Um, they provide methods of enforcement for laws or rules. And many, I mean, if we think about our own society, many of these enforcement measures are penal, meaning, punishment. So you break a law, nobody's going to just jokingly chide with you and be like, oh, you probably shouldn't have done that. Well, I mean, maybe they will if you're rich and white, right? But for the vast majority of people, for those who are not in positions of power, it's going to be through legal punishment, through prison, through financial ruin with fines and kind of restitution that you have to pay. So these all fall under this kind of umbrella of the state. Within a state, you do well if you're a member of the ruling class, basically. You do much less well if you are just a normal kind of individual. So with states come a much larger degree of inequity. With states comes this division between the haves and the have-nots, the 99% and the 1%, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Doesn't matter what terminology we give it, we see this distinct stratification with exploitation and prejudice and discrimination among those at the lower tiers of the social hierarchy. So for our first thinking critically, a complex institution like your college or university, like the school that you want to teach in, etc., there are many ways of governing the faculty, staff, and student body. These can include formal institutions of government. So CNM, UNM both have faculty senates. They have a president. They have official like HR resources where you can make complaints, as well as less formal associations and belief structures that help maintain order. Right? We've got a power differential between me and you. Instructors, professors are generally seen as holding power over their students. Do we? Yes, absolutely. I have the power to give you a grade, right? And you trust in the fact that the grade that I give you is going to be based on the work that you do rather than personal favors, rather than whether you think I like you or not, right? And, in an online setting, there's that anonymity. I mean, I haven't met many of you, most of you, actually. We might not even be living in the same city. But I have this ethical obligation then to treat you in a professional manner, to assign your grades based on the work that you do, etc. These are less formal than the structure of the administration at the college. But you've got means of redress, right? If you feel like I've violated my ethical standard, you're able to make complaints to my department head, to the president's office, to the dean of students. We also, though, have these ways that we mediate our friendships and our social relationships. What are some of these less formal forms of government? And how do they contribute to the maintenance of order? If you are part of the education cohort, right, how are you going to do classroom management? How do you anticipate you're going to maintain order in your classroom versus in your school versus in your school district, right? So I want you to think on that and reflect on that some, because there is golly, adults teaching children, there's absolutely a power differential, right? What power do you anticipate that your students will hold? What obligations will they have versus the obligations that you have? All right, so this discussion of power necessitates then a definition of political power. Beginning in the 1960s, anthropology, or the emphasis in anthropology, shifted from ordering societies to exploring how individuals acquire and use power within societies. Because power, of course, is concentrated in the hands of your leadership. But that doesn't mean that the people in leadership roles are the only people who possess power. I mean, we all have power in some form or another. It comes in many forms. So for political power to be legitimate, it has to be based on culturally recognized sources. In early history, that would have been deities, right? This tie between religion and politics. It may be in the power of the ancestors when we look at foraging and tribal organization, particularly when they practice what's called animist religion. That means religion based on the belief in supernatural beings, in spirits, etc. Oftentimes, and the reason they're called animist, these may be animal spirits or really strongly tied to nature, but these also include what we call ancestor worship. It may be hereditary transfer. I mean, this is how the monarchies are passed on, right? This is how that position of pharaoh was passed on in historical Egypt. It may be legal inheritance. This is really what condenses money and power in modern Europe and modern America. Uh, and this really became a concern during colonial empire building. One of the reasons why we saw periods of war from the Crusades on, and we saw colonial empire building was because we had issues of inheritance. There was a really, really, so there's another anthropology instructor here at CNM named Sue Ruth. And Sue is married to an anthropology professor over at UNM, Jim Boone. And Jim Boone did a really interesting study in the 1980s. He's both an evolutionary anthropologist and an archaeologist, and he was looking at historical documents in Portugal. And what he tracked was a difference in inheritance patterns that then led to differences in investment in your children based on kind of where you fell within the tiers of nobility. And so, in this context, prior to about 1380, Portugal practiced something called bilateral partible inheritance. Now, what does that mean? Bilateral means both males and females could inherit. Partible meant you divided your inheritance up among your children. This may be what you expect when your parents or your grandparents die, right? It may be that you expect that their financial legacy, their estate, is going to be equally divided amongst you and your siblings. This is not required. There's nothing in like U.S. legal code that guarantees you an inheritance when your parents die. Your parents could leave it to, I don't know, Animal Humane or something like that. You can have what's called disinheritance. But anyway, Portugal before 1380, land was not at a premium and population density was still pretty low. So that meant you could subdivide your land and your heirs could simply acquire more by forming a military and going out and claiming more land. And so both your daughters and sons could inherit. After 1380, because of increasing population density, there was more competition over inheritances. And so they very abruptly, in the archaeological and demographic record, shifted from that bilateral partible inheritance to a system of what's called unigeniture. Una means one, right? Uno. Geniture means male based inheritance. And so unigeniture means that only one son is going to inherit. In most cases, that was what was called primogeniture. The firstborn son inherits. And this is still what we associate with things like the passing on of the monarchy in Britain, though it's not necessarily restricted to the son, right? But it's a birth order effect. So Prince William is higher, kind of in the sequence than Prince Harry. So I'm sorry, I spaced for a moment on the younger prince's name. So we've got this system of birth order and its effects on what you are likely to inherit. And this created some really interesting kind of child investment sort of strategies. This was at a time where disease was still really high. So you didn't want to have only one or two kids because we still faced an adult mortality risk of 34%. So 34% of prime aged adults would die of some sort of disease, namely the plague. So you needed your firstborn son to be able to inherit, but you also needed somebody kept in reserve in case your firstborn son died. And so your secondborn son and sometimes your thirdborn son would be sent one of two places: the monarch or the monastery. Generally, they'd be sent to the monastery. They'd be sent to live as clerics, or they'd be sent to some male-only, like university sort of institution where celibacy was generally guaranteed. They weren't going to be married. They weren't poised to inherit unless their older brothers died. But if you had sons beyond, like a second and third son, then they were left to their own devices. These were the males that fought the Crusades, that had military titles but no land to inherit. These were the sons that went off on colonial kind of searches, expeditions, to find new land and to find new pools of natural resources for Europe to exploit. So people like Cortez, da Gama, Columbus, etc. These were latter-born sons of lower tier of nobility families. If you had daughters, if you were very, very well-to-do in any of these kind of situations, you were incredibly concerned with chastity and fidelity. So this is the age of things like chastity belts. This is where we see methods of female claustration. Females only being allowed to be in the company of other females or males who were their relatives. So we've got veiling and seclusion. We've got female incapacitation, like foot binding in China, like corseting throughout Europe. So we also saw during this time in Portugal, we saw what was called dowry competition. We talked a little bit about dowry as we talked about bride price or bride wealth. With respect to Maasai women. Dowry was a form of female-female competition. So your daughter, at the highest tiers of nobility, you funneled all of your investment into your son, your firstborn son. But at the lower tiers of nobility, because you didn't have anything for your son to inherit, you funneled your resources into your daughters. so that you could amass a large enough dowry that they would be able to marry up. So we had intense competition among families of noble women to secure favorable marriages to higher ranking males. So it's really kind of interesting how population density can lead to these really sometimes horrific kind of skews, and it was all a worry of inheritance. And it was all because inheritance, once it was land based, couldn't really be subdivided. If you divided up your land holdings between your kids, then each of your kids ends up with less land than what you as parents had. And so you wanted to keep that large estate in the hands of one of your children. We can also have elected office. This is certainly what we find in democratic states, right? In what we would call democratic nations. So much of Western Europe, the US, etc., we have this belief that kind of our vote matters and that we are able to elect our leaders. Power can also be drawn from material resources. So wealth brings you power. This is certainly true in the US. It can come from human resources. Having a controllable workforce brings you power. Being able to offer a lot of jobs and breed like employee loyalty can bring you power. Symbolic resources. This is really through material and symbolic resources. This is where a lot of the power of the Catholic Church comes from, right? So having access to religious relics can bring you power, or ideological resources. There is this notion of, and it's collapsing right now, but the ivory tower of academia, right? That having enough intellect or being kind of on the forefront of discovery could also bring you power. You can also get power simply from charisma, from being a really engaging speaker, from making people basically like you, through spouting rhetoric, through, when people like you, that gives you as an individual more power over them. Political power is action oriented. So everywhere in the world, people gain and manage political power through a combination of decision making, cooperation, opportunism, compromise, collusion. Collusion is where you kind of scheme with your allies to do better than a competitor. Charm, gamesmanship, strategic alliances, factionalism, resistance, conflict, and other processes. We've got a lot of tools at our disposal to work to maintain power. Some of these tools are legal, some of these tools are not. Some of these tools are moral, some of these tools are not. And so a focus on these processes that reinforce power was central to what we call action theory, which was an approach that emerged also in the 1960s. To follow political action, you have to be familiar with a society's specific rules and codes about who gets to exercise power and under what conditions. The past 4 years have been incredibly interesting, because we've seen potential accused, sometimes even kind of legitimate misuses of power, yet we as a populace have remained very incapable of sanctioning these misuses of power, right? It's been a political trying to think of a non-curse word way to describe this, but we've been watching the S word show, right? We really, really have, in the sense of what had traditionally been perhaps faith, at least some faith, in our government, has been just watching blatant misuse of power. And yet we've still been powerless to be able to do anything about that. I mean, this is something that people of color have dealt with basically since the inception of our country, right? So this is part of what's behind protests. This is part of what's behind Black Lives Matter. This is part of what's behind the counter protests to some of these fundamentalist white supremacy groups that have been marching to preserve things like statues of Confederacy leadership in states like Virginia, South Carolina, Texas, etc. So, um, what we're witnessing here is then the resistance to what may be illegitimate exercising of power. So, in politics, we've got two different kinds of rules. We have normative rules. These are the fairly stable and explicit ethical norms by which players must abide. And we've got pragmatic rules, the creative manipulations necessary to win the game itself. Okay, so we've got gameplay and we've got strategy. We've got legal codification like don't kill people or you will be prosecuted. And then we've got manipulation like kill black men if they're opposing, or resisting arrest. So we've got both the formal codified law that may or may not be applied equally among people of different identities, and we've got strategic manipulation. So one of the things that's been rampant in the South in particular since really the Jim Crow era is a practice called gerrymandering. Have you heard of that? Gerrymandering is where you manipulate the kind of the lines demarcating precincts or regions for voting. And so the gerrymandering that's been done in the South, it's part of the Jim Crow area. It was a way of drawing political boundaries so that you would maximize the number of white people elected into office. And gerrymandering has been differentially practiced among parties that have been in power, but the overall effect has been an institutional method, a strategy method to minimize the likelihood that progressive black candidates will be elected into political office. That's not legal. That's not something codified in law. That's part of this pragmatic manipulation to maintain the status quo and keep your wealthy white men in power. Political power is also structural. By the 1980s and 1990s, cultural anthropologists recognized that there was an additional need to investigate structural power. So David Horn David Horn in 1994 used this concept to trace a rise in Italian acceptance of state intervention in healthcare decisions. Global capitalism has been a primary source of structural power. The fact that we have recognized in the United States that corporations carry the same rights as people. And one of the things that is horrifying is that in the eyes of the law in the US, corporations are people, but you know who isn't? Women. Women are not considered people. We don't have codified law that provides equal rights to women through either sex designation or gender designation. So we have a long way to go still to give that same kind of political power to people who've not traditionally had privilege or advantage, or people who have not traditionally had economic wealth, people who've not traditionally expressed or held that political power. And so global capitalism is able to constrain, inhibit, and promote economic and political choices. How does global capitalism, how do these multinational corporations play in politics? Well, one of the ways is through lobbying, right? Why do we sweeten our sodas with high fructose corn syrup instead of cane sugar? Have you had a U.S. Coca-Cola compared to either a European or a Mexican Coca-Cola? They taste fundamentally different because Coke in other countries is still sweetened with sugar. Coke in the U.S. is sweetened with high fructose corn syrup. That was all because of the corn lobby in like the 1960s. So we've got lobbying efforts. We've got the funding of research. Should you, for example, trust biomedical research that is funded by pharmaceutical companies? I mean, you have to recognize the conflict of interest there, right? Pharmaceutical companies would love to have data that promotes acceptance of a new drug that's in their development pipeline. And through funding that research versus government funding, you can end up with biased scientific results. So we certainly are seeing this with the response to COVID, right? We're seeing a lot of resources being thrown to developing vaccines. We're seeing this hope to be able to fast track vaccines. And in those cases, we've seen the FDA relax the requirements for both animal models, for the animal models that have to be in place before human trials. So we're fast tracking drugs to use to combat novel coronavirus that likely have negative health consequences. I mean, think about the hydroquinone, right? The malaria drug that can treat COVID has led to heart attacks, cardiac problems in the people who've taken it. So that fast tracking of medications, not always a good idea, definitely driven by global capitalism. Political power is gendered. In a growing number of societies, women are beginning to exercise leadership in political power. This really depresses me, I have to say. With the knowledge that evolutionarily and prehistorically women had power. We hear this term patriarchy, right? What is a patriarchy? Well, it's a political structure that is ruled by men and is associated with lower status, lower rights, control of women. One of the questions that a lot of people have is, well, if we see patriarchies, could we have a matriarchy? If a matriarchy were the opposite of a patriarchy, then it would be a political system in which women have supreme control and are able to control the actions of men and subjugate men. This is like mythical Amazonia, right? This is like the tribe that Diana, i.e., Wonder Woman, comes from, where this idea that men are kept like on a leash as sperm donors, but it's women who are powerful, women who are expert armies, women who control everything. This is a myth. This is not, we've never had a human society where women monopolize all of the power and subjugate men. We do see matriarchies, but interestingly, matriarchies correspond to relative gender equality. So, what women are seeking to do worldwide is get equitable representation. And this isn't just a gender issue, should also be a race issue, because we should have leadership. If it's leadership by the people for the people, it should be leadership that reflects the identities of the people who elect that leadership. And so in that particular situation, it's having just as many, the same proportional representation of women in leadership as there are women in that population. We've got roughly equal sex ratios in the United States, so that would mean about half of our legislators being women. Interestingly, I'm just going to throw this out there, take from it what you will. The countries that have done better with their response to COVID are countries that have been led by women. So we're talking about places like New Zealand, Iceland, etc., where women have had the bulk of the, not the bulk, but equal representation, and some of the higher offices have been held by women. There's been successful management of that COVID-19 response. I mean, technically, New Mexico's we're kicking in butt here. We're doing a great job at managing COVID, and we owe that in part to a governor, whether you agree with her methods or you agree with her decisions or not. She took decisive, strong political action. So does that mean she's not that there aren't rumors of corruption? Does that mean that there are not mistakes that she's made? Of course not. But we've got strong female leadership in New Mexico, and though we haven't handled everything perfectly, we're doing better than a lot of the rest of the country in terms of managing our COVID response. So. In other societies, females have very little formally recognized power. They may be able to assert various types of informal power to shape events. So we talked, for example, about the Malay women with their spirit possession. In Papua New Guinea, these societies are very, very patriarchal. An abused or shamed woman act of revenge suicide shifts that burden of shame to her abuser and can even motivate her relatives to seek violent revenge. So she takes her own life and names her abuser to shift that focus. It's difficult for us to think of suicide as an expression of power. Um, but power suicide as power occurs in or power occurs in many like, cultural specific forms, and suicide as kind of maintaining power or utilizing your power is not unique just among these strongly gendered populations in Papua New Guinea. There's in the Trobriand island, if you violate social norms as a male warrior, you also engage in ritual suicide. So this is not simply an isolated kind of cultural particularity. And so we're seeing worldwide gender protests. In many Islamic communities, male clerics justify restrictions on females with what we call Sharia law or customary Islamic law. Erica Friedel in 1994 described the subtle ways that Iranian women exercise power and subvert these rules. So if they're forced to wear headscarves, they glam up their headscarves. They wear them from modern fabrics and in a modern, stylish way. Their headscarves have decorations on them. It's a printed fabric instead of like a plain, unobtrusive sort of cotton. They style it in a way that reflects fashion trends, not in a way that submits to male rule. There are female privileges or pilgrimages, women's pilgrimages to escape repressive males. When they do it in under the guise of a religious experience, the clerics don't get to interfere with it, and males don't get to come along. So they orchestrate their own pilgrimages, their own kind of